It's my pleasure to welcome you to Arundel House for what is the second in a series of 5 presentations given by Nigel Inkster, our Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk, on the fascinating as well as important subject of China and the Internet. Those of you who attended the first in the series of talks might remember that it dealt really with the way in which China's attitudes towards the Internet were situated in a wider context of realizing the need for technological modernization and innovation as part of the challenge of developing China's economy, and also closing a gap between itself and some of the other key players in the international system. But Nigel, I think, also dwelt on the extent to which, in that process, concerns and preoccupations about the need to balance that openness with some regard for China's internal security requirements also took hold. This presentation is going to deal with somewhat more outward-facing issues. It's really about the degree to which China sees itself in the global Internet environment and the efforts it's undertaking now to try and shape and structure that environment in a way that corresponds more explicitly with interests and objectives that it's defining for itself. So Nigel, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. As Adam said, I looked in my last presentation at how the Chinese state sought to manage these tensions between the objectives of becoming an advanced informationized society whilst achieving sufficient control over information flows to, as they would see it, maintain social and political stability. And while most of China's focus to date has been on achieving this balance within its own borders, it's also been concerned with issues of global Internet governance and international cyber security. And the existing structure of Internet governance is seen by China as providing the USA and other early adopter Western states with a virtual stranglehold on the way the Internet is governed, so as to pose a direct security threat, both in terms of the West's capacity to restrict China's Internet access in extremis and to use the Internet as a vector for the transmission of subversive information to promote regime change. And by the same token, China is anxious to find ways to limit what it sees as a US military cyber capability, exemplified by the establishment in 2009 of the US Cyber Command, that presents a possible existential threat to which China has currently no answer. And until very recently, China's approach to both of these issues has been relatively low-key and cautious in ways which have reflected its wider foreign policy posture. It's been content for Russia to make much of the running in terms of international diplomacy, while always making clear its own position. But in recent months, there's been a marked change towards a much more extrovert and self-confident posture based on a growing recognition that its status as a country with the world's largest netizen community and its status as the world's largest manufacturer of personal computers provides it with the potential increasingly to impose its own values and priorities on the global agenda. It's clear now that China has decided that if it is to achieve its stated aim of transitioning from a large cyber state to a strong cyber state, 从网络大国走向网络强国, it must become more internationally proactive, and that's what I want to talk about today. And international preoccupations about Internet governance emerged around the turn of the millennium, at around the point when the Internet was beginning to really take off at a global level. And a particular focus of attention was the whole domain name system, which translates numerical IP addresses into domain names, which actually mean something to us and which we can remember, with the domain name registry constituting in effect the phone book of the Internet. And the ability to manage the allocation of domain names, including the top-level domain names that give countries access to the Internet, in effect represents the ability to control the Internet, since without a domain name you just don't exist online. And since 1998, the power to allocate domain names has been vested uniquely in ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, set up in California as a not-for-profit entity answerable to the US Department of Commerce. This power was perceived as conferring on the US government. The power that this was perceived as conferring on the US government was something to which many other states objected, as did a lot of non-governmental entities, such as the Internet Society and the Internet Engineering Task Force, which together with the major technology companies and other actors played important roles in the informal and pragmatic set of arrangements for Internet governance that has been described as the multi-stakeholder model, in which national governments are simply one and by no means the preponderant actor. For China, the de facto US control of the domain name system represented a strategic threat, as it feared that in extremis the US could exclude China's top-level domain from the Internet's 13 root servers, thus cutting off China's communications. The first serious international effort to address this situation took the form of the World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS, convened under the auspices of the United Nations in 2003. At this event, China was already setting out its stall, calling for discussion of an international Internet treaty and an intergovernmental Internet organization. In one of the preparatory meetings for WSIS, China's ambassador Xia Zhukang said, "Countries with different social systems and cultural traditions will handle the transition to the information society differently. Information infrastructure will be the foundation of future economic progress, but it is weak in developing countries," in parentheses by implication including China, and managing the transition will demand policy responses across a broad front in line with national conditions. The security of the state will be a high priority. The developed countries should have an obligation to transfer technologies and develop the human resources. The private sector and civil society will be important drivers, but in framing international responses, governments should be in the lead. And during WSIS itself, the Chinese delegation stated that, and I quote, "Policy authority for Internet-related public policy issues is the sovereign right of states." And China was one of a number of major states arguing for a broad approach to Internet governance, with responsibility for global Internet governance falling to the United Nations, whereas the US and its allies argued for a narrow approach focusing on core technical resources via the multi-stakeholder model. And since the US had the whip hand in terms of technology and networks, little was achieved at WSIS, and the same was largely true of successor events organised by the UN, the Working Group on Internet Governance, which met during 2004 and 5, and concluded, inter alia, that the Internet should not be governed by a single entity. The Working Group on Internet Governance gave rise to the Internet Governance Forum, the IGF, a group with no formal membership, which has continued transacting a range of business. And perhaps the next major event in what has become increasingly an ideologically based battle over global Internet governance took place in 2012 in Dubai at the World Conference on International Telecommunications, WICIT. All these meetings sound depressingly the same, and it really is a struggle to remind yourself which is which. Ostensibly convened to renegotiate the international telecommunications regulations, which governed issues such as spectrum allocation and had last been revised before the Internet had been a reality, WICIT found itself becoming a battleground between those countries advocating top-down government control of the Internet, led by Russia and China, versus those advocating the merits of the multi-stakeholder model. And the outcome of WICIT might perhaps best be characterized as Voltairean, in the sense that all parties prayed to God for victory before the battle, and after the battle, all parties thanked God for having given them victory. In practice, it changed very little, though as countries such as China and Russia perceived the way that these issues had been reported in Western media, they were quick to modify their own discourse to emphasize that they had no objection to the multi-stakeholder model per se, but were rather arguing for a leading role for governments in areas where that was appropriate. But it is the case that under continuing international pressure, the US government has gradually relinquished its oversight of ICANN, and ICANN has, very gradually, made its governance processes more accessible to other states, and has established a wider presence in the developing world through the increase in the number of regional ICANN registries. The situation, however, remains far removed from China's ideal end state, which is for ICANN to become an international NGO. Meanwhile, China is working to exploit the advent of IPv6 with its capacity to generate an almost infinite number of addresses, unlike IPv4, which risks running out of sufficient addresses to meet rapidly rising demand. And we may well see a situation in the future in which China simply creates its own domain names and presents ICANN and the world with a fait accompli. International diplomacy relating to Internet governance has since proliferated and, in a sense, fragmented, reflecting both the impossibility of encompassing all the relevant complexities within one forum and the growing array of actors with different agendas and priorities. China has now taken its own initiative with the convening from 19 to 21 November of the World Internet Conference in the town of Wuzhen, the birthplace of the noted Chinese author Lu Xun. There is much symbolism in this move, but as I will elaborate in due course, there is more to it than just symbolism. Suffice to say that for now, China has no plans to give up its efforts to erode the grip of the United States and its allies on Internet governance, and is playing a long game, calculating that over time it can exploit the natural evolution of Internet infrastructure away from US dominance, while working to build pragmatic alliances in support of its own agenda. On cybersecurity, international discussion on issues of cybersecurity was actually slower to take off than was the case with global governance, and initially the two agendas were kept quite separate, though over time they have tended to converge. But as realization grew about the security vulnerabilities inherent in existing Internet design, so international pressure grew for concerted action to mitigate and manage these vulnerabilities. The first substantive move was made by Russia in 2003 with the proposal that the UN Secretary General establish a governmental group of experts, UNGGE, on information security. And that term, information security, is important since it encapsulates the divide between states, including China, whose primary concern is with the capacity of the Internet to serve as a vector for ideological subversion, and which translates into a desire for states to have the acknowledged right to control content, versus the USA and its allies, whose primary concerns are a commitment to the free and untrammeled flow of information as envisaged by the Internet's founding fathers, and who see security as needing to focus on the integrity and hygiene of networks. This disparity of perceptions was one contentious issue that arose out of the first UNGGE in 2004. The second related to a Russian proposal regarding the need to address, I quote, new threats posed by state exploitation of ICTs for military and national security purposes. The USA made clear its objection to any suggestion that states may have the right to control content, and stated that the law of armed conflict and its principles of necessity and proportionality and limitation of collateral damage already govern the use of such technologies. Following the failure of the first UNGGE, Russia continued pressing for further activity through the medium of UN General Assembly resolutions, and was joined in this process by other states, including China. In 2009, a second GGE was established against a backdrop in which hitherto largely theoretical preoccupations had been replaced by real-world examples of cyber threats at a state level, including the 2007 and 2008 attacks against Estonia and Georgia, and the USA's announcement of the establishment of US Cyber Command. The second of the iteration of the GGE came up with 4 recommendations for international consideration. A dialogue on norms for the state use of ICTs to reduce risk and protect critical infrastructure, and this has given rise to a huge global industry on the discussion of cyber norms in which we've been engaged. Confidence building and risk reduction measures, including discussion of ICTs in conflict, information exchange on national legislation and national ICT security strategies, policies and technologies, and capacity building in less developed countries, and the elaboration of common terms and definitions of information security. In 2011, Russia took a further step, together with China, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, by circulating a code of conduct for information security, which sought, inter alia, to proscribe state use of cyber weapons, and to enshrine the right of states to control internet content. China issued the following statement on the code. The International Code of Conduct for Information Security raises a series of basic principles of maintaining information and network security which cover the political, military, economic, social, cultural, technical, and other aspects. The principles stipulate that countries shall not use such information and ICT as a network to conduct hostile behaviors and acts of aggression or to threaten international peace and security, and stress that countries have the rights and obligations to protect their information and cyberspace, as well as key information and network infrastructure from threats, interference, and sabotage attacks. The code, unsurprisingly, received short shrift from Washington, but continues to be promoted by its authors as a basis for some form of international agreement. The most recent phase of the UNGGE ended in June 2013 with, against all expectation, an agreement based on a diplomatic compromise that gave each of the 2 ideological camps something. On the one hand, the US and its allies secured acceptance of the proposition that existing international law was applicable within the cyber domain. On the other, Russia, China, and the other authoritarian states secured acceptance of the principle that existing concepts of state sovereignty applied within the cyber domain. This deal was actually quite a close-run thing, and it seems that China was disinclined to accept it at first, but found itself isolated when, somewhat surprisingly, Russia proved willing to sign up. And in practice, all the deal has really done has been to create the conditions for the UNGGE to continue functioning, with a membership expanded, I think, now to 20 states, all of which, by no means all of which are, so to speak, recognized cyber powers, but representative of the global community. As in all such diplomatic agreements, the devil was in the detail, and one particular point of contention has been the US's insistence that international humanitarian law, better known as the law of armed conflict, was included within it. Neither Russia nor China has formally accepted that contention, not, of course, because they're arguing that law of armed conflict isn't part of international law, and it manifestly is, but because of the practical difficulties involved in applying it within the cyber domain. And interestingly, while Russia has shown no disposition to give ground on this issue, China has actually shown greater pragmatism and flexibility in being willing at least to explore these issues within Track 1.5 and Track 2 context. The Chinese position is well articulated in a recent article by one of my colleagues in the Chinese Institute of Contemporary International Relations, which is our counterpart organization in the Track 1.5 cybersecurity dialogue that we conduct on behalf of the United Kingdom. And it says, China's stance is that the nations of the world should cherish the value of cyberspace, the first human-made space, and should firmly oppose the militarization of the Internet. China advocates for the peaceful use of cyberspace. It maintains a position of no first use of cyber weapons, nor will it attack civilian targets. China's views are that the current UN Charter and the existing laws of armed conflict all apply in cyberspace, in particular the no use of force and peaceful settlement of international disputes imperatives, as well as the principles of distinction and proportionality in regards to the means and methods of warfare. However, the issue of how to apply jus ad bellum and jus in bello still faces intense debate. And it is true that the applicability of the law of armed conflict in the cyber domain raises many difficult issues. In the absence of attribution to a beyond reasonable doubt level, how does one determine with confidence from where an attack has originated? And in the absence of clearly agreed international definitions, including what a cyber attack actually is, how does one determine whether a cyber attack rises to a level that would justify an armed response, either within the cyber domain or cross-domain? How does one deal with issues of distinction and proportionality, given that the networks through which an attack would be routed are almost by definition dual use and will be relied upon by civilian non-combatants to conduct most facets of their daily lives, and that a response within domain may well have unanticipated second and third order effects on parts of the global network that have not been targeted? How does one deal with the issue of neutrality in circumstances where a cyber attack is routed through the network of a third party which may either be unwitting of the fact or incapable of taking action to prevent it? These are difficult questions with which we here, IISS, are currently wrestling, and it's encouraging to report that our Chinese counterparts have shown interest in exploring these with us. One area in particular in which China has taken the lead relates to the topic of what they refer to as cyber terrorism, by which is meant the use of ICT to promote terrorist and specifically Islamist terrorist ideology. This initiative reflects China's concern about a rising tide of Uyghur separatist incidents within China itself, something described in some detail in a recent IISS strategic comment, and a concern about the proselytizing and mobilizing impact of Islamic State's ideology. China has shown itself insistent in seeking coordinated international action through the UNGGE to close down websites involved in disseminating this ideology, and has sought, so far without much evidence of success, to allay Western concerns that this is simply a backdoor route to hunt down and silence its critics outside the country. And I think it's fair to say that Western diplomats have been somewhat taken aback to discover the importance China's leadership appears to attach to this topic, and it remains to be seen whether a response is capable of being generated which will meet everybody's concerns and interests. Meanwhile, the last 18 months have witnessed some intriguing developments in terms of China's approach to the international dimensions of Internet governance and cyber security. The first development was the appointment within the Chinese Foreign Ministry of a cyber coordinator, mirroring a development that has been increasingly common among major developed countries. The first holder of this post, Mr. Fu Cong, is an accomplished and experienced diplomat with extensive multilateral experience, and he has been quick to make his presence felt. Fu Cong's appointment comes as China has developed a range of Track 2, Track 1.5 and Track 1 engagements with major counterparts, starting with the USA at Track 2 and then Track 1, and now including the United Kingdom, led by us, and the European Union. But more significant, I think, has been a rapid evolution of China's central policy mechanisms, in particular the establishment in 2013 of a new top-level party entity, the leading small group on cybersecurity and information technology, which is one of the leading small groups chaired by President Xi Jinping. As reported by the Chinese political commentator Wang Yukai, the agenda of the new LSG, Leading Small Group, encompasses the following points. Infrastructure, including network size and broadband penetration. A clear international strategy that lays out priorities and defends China's right to have a voice on cyber issues. Independent technology capabilities, especially in the areas of operating systems and central processing units. The ability to defend networks for national security, economic security, user privacy and social stability and harmony. And competitiveness in the development of software applications, e-commerce and online markets. And finally, this is the best, occupying the commanding heights of cyberspace. Right, what does that mean? Well, the new Leading Small Group is serviced by a general office headed by Lu Wei, a former journalist and propaganda chief within the Beijing municipality, who is also the head of a ministerial level body variously called the State Internet Information Office and the Cyber Administration of China. Lu has been even faster to make his presence felt in setting out what looks like a much more assertive Chinese cyber policy posture, consistent with China's generally more assertive foreign policy posture since Xi Jinping's assumption of office. Some of Lu's early statements are fairly indicative of where that policy seems to be going. Thus, at the World Economic Forum in Tianjin earlier in 2014, Lu observed, "Freedom and order are twin sisters, and they must live together. The same principle applies to security. So we must have a public order internationally, and this public order cannot impact any particular local order." Lu also likened the internet to a car, adding that all cars needed to have brakes. And on the issue of China's exclusion of Western social media, such as Facebook, Lu stated, "Your websites are your home. How can I close down sites in your home? China has always been hospitable, but I have a choice about who comes to be a guest in my home. I can say that I have no way of changing you, but I have a right to choose my friends." The 2014 World Internet Conference in Wuhan, to which I referred earlier, is in effect Lu's coming out party and seems to have been calculated to make a strong political statement. And interestingly, it appears to have been organized largely without reference to the foreign ministry, who at best have played an ancillary role. And the conference, which is to be institutionalized in the same way as the London conference has been, as an annual event, can be seen as an integral part of a diplomatic initiative aimed at securing greater international support for a Chinese approach that has become more apologetic about demanding respect for its own priorities and values, while seeking to erode US control of the global cyber agenda without in the process provoking an outright breach. In this context, it's worth noting how China reacted to the Snowden revelations. While these were extensively reported, or more properly misreported, in the Chinese media, the Chinese government publicly said little about them, being content to let the revelations speak for themselves in substantiating a narrative of US global cyber hegemony to which they had all along subscribed. It took the indictment of 5 PLA officers by the US Department of Justice to elicit a more explicit and active response in the form of a report published by China's Internet Media Research Center entitled "A Record of US Global Surveillance Activities," setting out the Snowden revelations in exhaustive and misleading detail and stating that, I quote, "Such activities have gone way beyond the imperatives of the counter-terrorism agenda and have demonstrated the ugly face of a country that is prepared to put aside morality in pursuit of its own interests. Such activity is a flagrant violation of international law," not clear on what basis that conclusion is reached, "is a serious infringement of human rights, ditto, and substantially harms global security." They may have more of a case. Of late, Snowden has occupied relatively little space in the Chinese media or in the pronouncements of Chinese officials, suggesting a carefully calibrated response. And when Snowden revelations are referred to by official Chinese officialdom, it is always in relations to the activities of a particular country, 个别的国家, rather than the US by name. And I think, to sum up, China's motivations in pursuing the approach outlined above are driven by a combination of positive and negative factors. The positive factor is a genuine sense by the Chinese leadership of growing international self-confidence and a determination to have a role in mapping out the global, the international order going forward. The negative drivers are a fear of US military and cyber supremacy, and the perennial concern of China's leadership about a lack of political legitimacy derived from the ballot box. Up to this point, I think it's probably been safe to say that China's main aim, in terms of international cyber diplomacy, has been to minimize the threat posed by perceived US supremacy and to create for itself a less insecure global environment through international agreements designed to constrain US behavior. But under this more assertive and confident dispensation that we're starting to see, I don't think the possibility can be discounted that this approach will evolve into a determination to match the US in terms of its capabilities, an objective which has actually already been set out, but so far into the future, 2050, as to be virtually meaningless in terms of contemporary practical politics. And meanwhile, the reality is that China is increasingly feeling that it can achieve its aim of having a managed internet within China whilst remaining globally connected to the extent needed to achieve its wider strategic objectives. And its message to the world does now increasingly seem to be, you can have it all. You can have the benefits of connectivity, but you can control what comes and goes through your sovereign national cyber space. And how this actually plays out in practical terms remains to be seen, and I would argue that what we are in effect now seeing is a fascinating global experiment with uncertain outcomes and consequences. China's recent history has always been one of constant unresolved tensions between openness and accessibility on the one hand, and an overriding emphasis on national security seen in terms of the exclusion of undesirable outside influences on the other. And these tensions have always been evident within China's own top leadership. Until relatively recently, events seem to be favouring the former approach, the emphasis on openness and accessibility. But it now seems that under President Xi Jinping, the security agenda is starting to take priority. Again, this is an intriguing experiment at a national level, the outcome of which is equally uncertain, but which we can safely assume is going to have wider global consequences, particularly if, as I believe it probably will, China's vision of how global governance of the internet evolves will increasingly gather support, particularly amongst developing countries who don't currently know what they think, but are instinctively inclined to favour a more cautious and security-oriented approach. So watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I was struck in your presentation by the way in which you describe policies in China that emerge in a quite linear fashion, obviously the result of deep reflection inside the system about what is in China's interest. But in the latter part of your presentation, you were suggesting that maybe there are differences in preference in terms of emphasis on openness versus security. I mean, what are the constituencies within China that are negotiating this distribution of emphasis, and what are the criteria that they will latch onto in order to make an ultimate decision as to where they need to place themselves?
Okay, well, I mean, you have on the one hand the experts, so to speak, at a technical level and indeed at a policy level, who are instinctively inclined to favour policies that promote functionality and efficiency of the network. When I was in Beijing earlier this year at a conference organised by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, there was a presentation from one of the from somebody who had formerly been in the Chinese computer emergency response team, and he said at this conference, you know what, when it was just between us at the technical level, international cooperation was absolutely fine, absolutely straightforward. The trouble began when the politicians got involved. So I'm not sure he'll necessarily be invited back, but what he said had more than an element of truth in it. So there is a technical community that is acutely aware of what China still needs to do if it is going to realise its overarching objective of becoming an advanced informationised society. Similarly, within, I think, the academic community, there is a very, in my experience, and Anakin, my colleague, may well want to add something on this, a very sophisticated appreciation of the risks associated with an overly securitized approach to the internet. But of course, at the end of the day, it is at the top policy level that these things are decided. And I made the point in my previous presentation that whereas in the West, the evolution of the internet and the evolution of capabilities has been driven very much by a private sector enabled by government. In China, we've seen almost the converse of that. It has been at every stage the top level leadership which has taken the informatization process by the scruff of the neck and moved it on to the next phase in the face of quite a lot of institutional inertia, and I think that is what we are now seeing. So, in that sense, one could argue that this doesn't necessarily represent a break from what has happened before, but it does, I think, change the terms of the debate. China's growing self-confidence, growing assertiveness, combined with a growing appreciation of its vulnerabilities in terms of dependence on US technologies, I think have all combined, to push for this new "you can have your cake and eat it" approach. And I think that what we've seen them doing is very cautiously and pragmatically moving around the world, testing out positions, developing alliances and constituencies wherever they can, probing the positions of countries like the United Kingdom, which are seen as not always friendly, but at least have the benefit of not being the United States of America, to see what is practically possible.
Thanks. Okay, we'll open it up to questions from the floor. First to catch my eye is Cho Kong from Shell. Other people, when I call you, if you could, for the benefit of Nigel, identify yourself as well.
Thank you, Adam. Cho Kong from Shell. Nigel, two questions. One, this new assertive Chinese position. To what extent would you link it with Xi Jinping himself? I mean, he's taken a lot of new initiatives in many different policy areas, and this seems to strike very much to his character. So to what extent does this come from the very top? And second, you described this approach of wanting to have your cake and eat it as well as a fascinating experiment. Do you think it's going to work?
Right, okay. Yeah, well, the first one, I think there is a lot to what you say, that Xi Jinping has taken a leadership stance which is very much counter to the recent trend of collective leadership, which was a conscious decision taken by China's top leadership quite a few years ago to try to ensure that nothing like the Cultural Revolution could be allowed to happen again. So the decision was very much consciously to move towards an approach based on collective leadership. And we saw the kind of, in a way, the reductio ad absurdum of that in the last 10 years under Hu Jintao, to the point where I think a lot of people in China have begun to talk about that particular period, that 10-year period, as a lost decade in which vested interests were able to become ever more entrenched to a point that militated against the economic and social development agenda. So I think Xi has come into office determined to break down some of those vested interests and create the circumstances for some of the major economic and social reforms that are now perceived as being necessary. But particularly, I think, when it comes to international affairs and international security, we have seen Xi himself taking a very ostentatious leadership role, and indeed, I would argue, quite high risk in the sense that he has no layer of insulation. If the economy tanks, Li Keqiang can take the fall. He can blame somebody else. But if China's foreign policy tanks for some reason, there doesn't seem to be a fall guy, obviously, in view. But I think that does indeed reflect to a significant degree Xi's own personality and perception. So I would agree that is a significant factor. On the second question, will this experiment work? Well, in a sense, you could kind of argue that it already is, insofar as the Chinese internet has rapidly evolved into a very distinctive ecosphere. I think I said last time it's kind of the reverse of the Columbus exchange. We started out with a single ecosphere and have gradually moved to separate and distinctive ecospheres in the cyber domain. And there are a lot of foreign websites to which Chinese citizens cannot easily acquire access, though they can generally always acquire access if they really want to. I find it in parentheses amusing that, for example, in China you can't access the BBC website, but if you have the BBC News on an app on your iPhone, it takes the bad guys about 3 or 4 days to work out what's going on and close you down, during which time you can actually continue to receive the BBC News. Now, what has been the effect of this? Is China cut off from the outside world? Well, you could argue that over time, the effect of an inability to access heterodox views and opinions and positions that challenge what becomes received wisdom within China will have a progressively damaging effect on China's intellectual evolution. And already, and I mentioned this in my last presentation, there is a recognition that China's higher education sector needs, in effect, dino-rodding to eliminate a culture of bureaucratization and placementship and actually encourage genuine innovation, initiative, and challenge. These are things that are not easily achieved by decree. So, I suspect that if the experiment doesn't work, the evidence for that could be quite some while in coming. it may not be immediately apparent, because to all intents and purposes China remains connected to the internet. It can get all it needs as it sees it for the time being, and is able to manage what are perceived as quite significant risks.
But to what extent do you think that the policies China is developing more assertively, as you say, looking for partners also in the outside world, in respect of these questions of internet, actually signal a more assertive, wider form of geopolitical competition, or at least are indicative of a certain mindset that might give rise to that? I mean, if you think of what the Cold War was, it was essentially about the incompatibility of two political economic systems. China obviously feels that there are aspects of incompatibility with its internet and the rest of the internet. Is this something that's logic is likely to apply more confidently, more assertively to broader diplomatic and strategic questions?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think and here I would argue that perhaps the moment of epiphany for China was the 2008 financial crisis, where they kind of woke up one morning and concluded that they'd been encouraged to worship a false god, and the degree of disgust and outrage within the Chinese leadership at this series of events cannot be overestimated. And let's not lose sight of the fact that whilst the 2008 crisis caused a lot of problems in the Western world, in China the effect was pretty alarming. Tens of millions of workers were thrown out of jobs. Entire cities in China lost their economic raison d'etre. And I think, I would argue that was probably the moment at which the iron entered the collective soul, if there is such a thing, of China's leadership, and encouraged them to believe that they needed to stop following Western policy prescriptions and find their own way, and also I think to leverage their growing international throw weight to stop being a rule taker, which is effectively what China has been, and start increasingly to be a rule maker in the international order. And we've seen this in a number of areas where China, for example, hasn't directly challenged the UN Law of the Sea Convention, but it is starting to kind of nibble at the edges and ask some quite penetrating questions as to the continued validity of that legal arrangement in its current format. And I think we can expect to see more of this, and particularly within the cyber domain, and particularly in the area of international cyber security. And I think they probably perceive correctly that they're pushing on an ever open door, as the US inevitably loses a certain amount of global influence, as the impact of the Snowden revelations has reduced international trust in the United States. There's no doubting that is the case. Probably the climate for this is more propitious now.
Anakin, please.
Anakin from Douglas. My question is, you said that China is emerging as a strong cyber state. And
that's what it wants to do.
Yes, and in the light of China so far being rather prudent and maybe cool-headed even about the international cyber dialogue, I wonder what might be some of the next questions or topics that China might either bring up or wait to come up in the international cyber dialogue. So is there something that they might be sort of waiting for, or that is not yet tabled but is should be coming to their side?
I'm not sure that there will necessarily be new issues. I mean, I think the landscape has been pretty well mapped, and I think what we're going to see now is an approach that is still largely going to be characterized by strategic patience, a willingness to wait the US and its allies out, to wear them down. And we were talking this morning, the proliferation of international conferences on global internet governments has reached levels where the Chinese might actually, I offer this only half facetiously, feel that they can kind of conference the USA out and sort of wear them down to the point where they might give ground where they would not naturally be inclined to do. So I think what we're going to see now is the Chinese sort of working away on the current agenda. Developing their own thinking, developing their own arguments, testing, what is possible, rather than seeking to introduce, substantive new topics. And one area I think that might be interesting, which China hasn't shown much inclination to think about publicly much, is the nexus between cyberspace and space. But I think that is one area, and logically, that then translates into the nexus with nuclear weapons related security issues. I think that is an area that we might see moving into greater focus as the Chinese develop confidence in thinking about these topics.
Do you think that's already actually happened, in the sense that I noted from the report you cited from our colleagues at Kicker that the principle was no use of force, but the posture was no first use in respect of cyber weapons, which is exactly China's nuclear posture. A posture underpinned then by all sorts of considerations about the extent of strategic modernization, nuclear sufficiency, distribution of capabilities, and so on.
I mean, within China that debate has been around for some while, and it's something that I will look at in greater depth when I come to look at the military dimension of China's cyber capabilities. But yes, of course, the awareness has always been there, and of course, one looks, for example, back to, let us say, the 2007 anti-satellite test that China conducted. Which I tend to see as an interesting exercise in Chinese-style deterrence, recognizing that the U.S. military supremacy was heavily space and cyber dependent, and seeking to demonstrate that that dependence was not something that could necessarily be taken for granted.
Ben, and then Tim, please.
Ben Trandowski, Peace Foundation. You mentioned earlier the questions of jus in bello and jus ad bellum. There was a very ancient paper written by an international lawyer in the 1990s on this subject. Although it's out of date, the main argument was that a cyber attack could be seen as an act of war if the consequences were comparable to that of an act of war. But my question is the problem of attribution too big for this argument to make sense, or is it also too much of an analogy, and do we need a different kind of thinking rather than simply stretching these legal analogies into the cyber domain?
Well, I mean, I think it's a general proposition, and this is, of course, one of the key differences between China, Russia, and the Western states. I think the Western view is that, as far as possible, existing law should be applied to these new situations, rather than new laws being particularly devised to deal with them. I think the United States, in relation to jus ad bellum, has already said that it reserves the right to respond kinetically to a cyber attack that creates damage comparable to that which a kinetic attack would have caused. Now, that is still far from being accepted universally as a justification, but it's what's there for the time being. Again, I think the inclination of China is largely to kind of challenge that, precisely because this is a place China doesn't want to go. They really don't want to go there, because they're acutely aware of how weak and vulnerable they actually are relative to their main putative opponent. So,
There's one main cable going into China, right?
well, I mean, one of the reasons it's so easy for the Chinese Ministry of Public Security to operate the Golden Shield monitoring system is that the number of actual access points, international internet access points into and out of China is very small. So yes, that does constitute a potential vulnerability. Yeah.
Tim Wilsey at King's College, London. If I recall correctly, it was the weekend before Obama was going to have breakfast with Xi Jinping and take him to task about what was then regarded as a sort of wholesale theft of intellectual property by the Chinese. That the Snowden revelations came out. He seems to have spectacularly taken the wind from the sort of Western sail on this. And I mean, much of your lecture was about the sort of slight victim mentality in China, feeling that others had first mover advantage. And where does that all stand now? I mean, it's still going on, presumably.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you really want to, get a complete answer to this, you need to come to the next lecture, which is going to be looking in detail at the whole cyber espionage situation. But to answer your question in very briefly, since the so-called shirt sleeve summit, at which this issue was first formally raised at a kind of top level, the assessment of US intelligence and other Western intelligence is that the intensity of attacks seeming to come out of China has actually increased. No, in that sense, I don't think anything significant has changed. And the basic argument the United States makes, namely that there is a difference between state espionage for the purposes of statecraft and economic espionage conducted by states, which the US argues is illegal under the World Trade Organization trade-related intellectual property rights law. Is not an argument that China is interested in exploring or entertaining. So, no, it's going on.
Gentleman right at the back there. Yeah.
Edward Hammer-Rabin, King's College. With regards to China's policy of controlling domestic internet whilst allowing others external control, would you argue that from a logical perspective that is, in a way, approaching it from the wrong aspect? Because since its inception from its days as the ARPANET, the internet is designed to spread communication and information almost freely, so either it's an all or nothing policy. And could you argue that within the next couple of years China is going to have to address that within its own leadership?
Well, I mean, China is, debating, this, this and many other similar issues within its leadership all the time. That's what the party school is there to do, and it does it actually, very well. But I go back to a basic proposition I've always held, which is that, China is not a culture that feels our sort of Cartesian Enlightenment need to set things out, in absolute, black and white, clear-cut terms. The Chinese epistemological tradition is actually, much more comfortable with ambiguity and, willingness to accept that something can be two things at once, or, sometimes one thing and sometimes the other. I mean, I know that when I was last in China, I made reference to the Chinese radical academic Hu Shi's fictitious figure, 差不多先生, Mr. Near Enough, which is something Hu Shi used to kind of pillory what he regarded as, China's traditional lack of concern with accuracy and precision, which was then seen as a major inhibitor to a modernization agenda that was kind of still stuck. But actually, I think I would argue that modern scientific thinking actually in some ways can privilege an approach that doesn't require such absolute finality and clarity. So I don't think the bottom line is that people in China are lying awake at night wondering about whether this is all absolutely logically coherent and precise. They're much more concerned about whether it will work and whether they can get away with it. And what will change their thinking is clear evidence that it's not working and then they're not getting away with it.
So,
Mika Kettunen, Cyber Policy Institute, Tartu, Estonia. I know, sir, that the military dimension is one of your lectures to come, but I would still like to hear, as it could be one of these commanding heights to be occupied. What is the role of PLA in terms of making China a strong cyber state or cyber nation even?
Well, the PLA has extensively documented and very ambitious proposals to assimilate cyber capabilities within its general capabilities through the concepts of integrated network electronic warfare and also this concept of information confrontation. So, the idea is really that what the PLA seeks to do is to create a multi-tiered cyber platform which is accessible by different tiers of military organizations, military units, and which combines cyber capabilities, electronic warfare capabilities, and information warfare capabilities. How far they've got, well, I'll look at that. At the moment, I think a lot of their thinking is derivative, and suggestions that this is all the product of some sort of deep mystic understanding of warfare based on Sun Tzu's Art of War, I think is frankly for the birds. I'm afraid I'm very sceptical about this sort of mysticism strain in certain analysis of the way the Chinese do things. But they do have, I think in some ways they do have a very different tradition, a very different epistemic tradition, as I just said. And that is having its impact. For example, one of the things about Chinese military is that the military thinking is that avoiding a fight is indeed one of the best things, best military outcomes. And the popular saying goes, of the 36 stratagems, flight is the best. So there are different ways of thinking about this. So I think the PLA has a major role to play, and of course, 3PLA, China's signals intelligence agency, is playing a major role in terms of the way in which cyber espionage is being conducted. But at the end of the day, it remains the case that the PLA are subordinate to the party. They ultimately will do what the party tells them to do, although in practice, on day-to-day issues, the military have been given a pretty free hand to do what they see fit. And I think one of the problems that China's got at the moment in this regard, and I think this is particularly true of the cyber espionage piece, is that there hasn't really been a proper top-level risk-benefit analysis conducted of some of these things, some of these capabilities. But at the end of the day, what we come back to, how do you define military cyber capabilities? Well, a lot of this is, of course, about what civilian cyber capabilities look like. And I think it is reasonable and fair to suggest that no country is likely to have significantly better military cyber capabilities than its civilian infrastructure and capabilities will allow. And in that regard, it remains true that China still has some quite significant weaknesses and vulnerabilities that need to be factored in when we assess how important and how capable China's military cyber power is.
Well, Nigel, I'm afraid we've exhausted our time in this lunch hour slot, but maybe I'll just give you a few seconds to make an advertisement for the next three presentations in the series of 5, so that people know what they're coming back to.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Adam. The next two presentations will look respectively at the whole question of China's cyber espionage, and we'll go into considerable detail about what that involves, what it's for, and what it means. The fourth presentation will look in detail at some of the military issues that I touched on briefly just now. And then the fifth presentation will be an attempt to try and pull this all together and ask what, as my former profession encouraged me to do, the question, so what? What are the implications of all of this for international security, for the international balance of power, and the way in which that is likely to evolve as far ahead as we can sensibly look. So those are the next three.
So not censor, but so what?
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm sure we'll all be there to hear it. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.